undertow and we say...
There's the undertow. The undertow, there's the undertow. We found the undertow when we see the undertow.
Dory, are you lost?
Where are your parents?
I can't remember.
Oh, we'll look around. Are any of these fish your parents?
Oh, I can't remember.
Hi, I'm Dory. Was it something I said? Kidding. Okay. You're not coming back.
Up, you have to go back to bed.
Mr. Ray, you got help.
Okey-dokey. All right, kids. Migration. Let's learn about migration. It's nature's inspiration to move around the sea. Here's a
Scientific promise.
Oh, she's not dead. Give her some space.
Is that I miss them. I really miss them. I didn't know what that felt like. Do you know what that feels like? It tells me they were mostly blue with maybe yellow. That sounds right. Also, I'm pretty sure I'm going to know them when I see them. We're family.
By the way, crossing the ocean is the kind of thing you should only do once.
Charlie!
These crabs are locals, and I get the feeling they're shushing us for a reason. It might wake up something dangerous.
Are you talking about like something with one big eye, tentacles, and a snappy thing?
Well, that's very specific, but something.
Welcome to the Cineflux. I am so glad you are here. The film we are exploring today is Finding Dory, released in 2016 by Pixar Animation Studios and Walt Disney Pictures. It is a sequel, the long-awaited, much-anticipated continuation of one of Pixar's most beloved works, Finding Nemo, which arrived in 2003 and became one of the defining animated films of its generation. Finding Dory was directed by Stanton, who also directed Finding Nemo, and co-directed here by Angus MacLane. It was produced by Lindsay Collins, and the screenplay was written by Stanton and Victoria Strauss. The voice cast includes Ellen DeGeneres returning as Dory, Albert Brooks returning as Marlin, with Hayden Rollins stepping into the role of Nemo. Newcomers to this world include Eronian as Hank, a brilliantly conceived octopus, or more precisely, as the film insists, a septopus, Diane Keaton and Eugene Levy as Dory's parents, Jenny and Charlie, and a luminous supporting ensemble that includes Idris Elba, Dominic West, Kate McKinnon, and Ty Burrell. It is a film for children in the sense that it speaks directly and honestly to the youngest, most open parts of us. But it is also, and this is the part I keep coming back to, a film that carries its deepest meanings in a language that children feel rather than analyze, and that adults suddenly recognize with something close to a sharp breath as their own. This is a film about disability. It is a film about memory and identity. It is a film about parents who are afraid for children they cannot protect forever. And it is a film about what it means to discover that the qualities that make you different are not separate from the qualities that make you remarkable. They are the same thing, expressed differently. The word this film habit is both continuation and expansion. We return to the open ocean, but we also enter the Marine Life Institute, a rehabilitation and conservation center on the California coast, modeled closely on the Monterey Bay Aquarium, with its dim blue corridors and its tide pools and its carefully constructed habitats for creatures who cannot survive without help. It is a world that is at once breathtakingly beautiful and quietly melancholy, tanks lit from within, glass walls that separate one kind of life from another, animals who have been rescued, cared for, and prepared for a return to the wild that they may or may not be ready for. The film finds genuine poetry in this setting. Because this is a place built around the idea of rehabilitation, of taking something broken or separated or lost and trying carefully to make it whole again. And that is also at its heart what this story is about. Andrew Stanton's vision for this world is one of warmth with an enormity. He has always understood that the ocean is not simply a backdrop, it is a character. In Finding Nemo, the ocean was vast and terrifying and full of wonder, a father's nightmare rendered in light and color. Here, the ocean is still present, still beautiful, but the emotional center has shifted inward. The journey this time is not through open water. It is through memory. It is through the architecture of a self that keeps collapsing and rebuilding. And so the visual world mirrors that interiority and closed spaces, blowing tanks, the hazy dreamlike quality of recollection filtered through imperfect remembering. What kind of story is this at its heart? It is a story about belonging, about the specific terror and tenderness of being someone who does not always know who she is, and the extraordinary discovery that she is nonetheless someone. Dory has always been a character defined by what she lacks: short-term memory loss, the inability to hold a thought, a name, a direction for more than a few moments at a time. In Finding Nemo, this quality was written primarily as comedy, as the endearing and often hilarious trait of a companion who means well and constantly, gloriously forgets. But what Stanton and Strauss understood in building this film was that there was always something else underneath that comedy, something quieter, something that deserved its own story and its own space. And this is why the film matters, because it asked the question that Nemo never needed to ask: who is Dory, beyond the forgetting? Now, let me tell you what it was like to sit with this film for the first time. When I first sat with Finding Dory, I expected something comfortable. I came in with warmth, with the residual love of Finding Nemo still somewhere in my chest, with the easy expectation of a sequel that would revisit the same emotional geography: the ocean, the adventure, the humor, the gentle themes of family and courage. I expected to enjoy it. I expected to feel something familiar. What I did not expect was for the film to open with a scene so quietly devastating that I needed a moment to recalibrate everything I thought I had come to experience. The film opens on a memory, or more precisely, it opens on what memory looks like when you live inside it imperfectly. We see a very young Dory, impossibly small, impossibly blue, impossibly earnest with her parents. Her mother and father are attentive in the particular way of parents who know that their child requires more care than most, not because they resent this, but because they have chosen, with everything they have, to make the world navigable for her. They teach her. They are patient. They love her with the kind of love that has no conditions and no exits. And the scene is rendered in the warm, hazy palette of early memory. Soft light, rounded edges, the world made safe by the presence of the people who made you. Here is the thing about this scene: it does not feel like setup. It feels like grief. It feels like the opening movement of something that knows exactly how much it is going to ask of you and is asking permission first. The music, Thomas Newman's score, which we will return to at length, enters so gently that you almost do not notice it, a soft piano line that carries something between wonder and sorrow, as if it cannot quite decide which one is more honest. And young Dory says something that lands with surprising weight. She tells her parents she suffers from short-term memory loss. The mispronunciation is sweet, of course, but the thing I felt, sitting there watching it, was not primarily sweetness. It was recognition. The recognition of a child trying to explain herself to the world using the only words she has, in the hope that the world will receive her with the same patience that her parents do. I did not expect this film to make me feel that, and I was not prepared for how quickly it established the difference between what it was and what I assumed it would be. The atmosphere of this film, from its very first minutes, is one of tender precariousness. That is the best way I can describe it. Everything is warm, everything is visually stunning, everything has the Pixar signature of a world rendered with such craftsmanship that you can almost feel the water on your skin and the light through the glass. But underneath all of that surface beauty is a note of fragility. Dory's world is always on the verge of becoming unfamiliar to her. Her sense of self is always just one moment of forgetting away from dissolving. And the film never lets you forget this, not cruelly but honestly, the way a story that genuinely respects its subject refuses to sentimentalize it into something easier. What struck me most in those opening scenes was the choice to make the comedy and the pathos completely inseparable. There are moments that are genuinely, warmly funny. Dory being Dory, her enthusiasm and her kindness and her peculiar logic, all intact and fully alive, and those same moments carry in the same breath a quality of gentle heartbreak, because you are watching someone navigate a world that does not always accommodate her, with a grace and a joy that she has had to construct entirely without the benefit of remembering how she got here. This is not easy to achieve in a film aimed at families and children. It is in fact extraordinarily difficult, and the fact that Finding Dory achieves it not perfectly, not without stumble, but genuinely, is the first signal that something more thoughtful than a typical sequel is happening here. Let me now walk you through this story not as a summary but as a journey, the emotional journey this film takes you on, if you let it. The story begins, in its present tense, about a year after the events of Finding Nemo. Dory is living near the coral reef with Marlin and Nemo, a small blue fish in a family that chose her, surrounded by a community that has, gently and gradually, made space for her. She is happy here in her immediate, unreflective way. She is cared for. She belongs. But there is something she cannot access. A feeling that keeps surfacing, like a word on the edge of the tongue, like a dream that vanishes the moment you try to describe it. And one day, triggered by a lesson about migration and by the particular pressure of a memory she cannot quite follow all the way to its origin, something breaks open in her. She remembers her parents. She does not remember them fully, the way you or I might remember a face or a place with sharpness and completeness. She remembers them in fragments of feeling, a phrase, a color of light that might have been their kitchen. But she knows, suddenly and urgently, that she came from somewhere, that there are people who made her and loved her, and are perhaps out there still, waiting in the only way that parents wait for children they have lost, with a hope so tenacious it has no other shape left. And so the journey begins. Dory, Marlin, and Nemo travel to California, to the Marine Life Institute, the place where Dory somehow knows, without knowing how she knows, that her story began. This is where the film opens up into something genuinely ambitious, because Finding Nemo was, at its structural core, a rescue narrative, a father's love expressed as relentless pursuit. The emotional logic was linear. Nemo is lost, Marlin must find him, the obstacles between them are external. The ocean itself is the antagonist in a sense, but Finding Dory does something more complicated. Its protagonist cannot follow a single thread of logic from beginning to end without losing it. Its journey is not linear, it is associative, fragmentary, recursive, built from the way memory itself works, especially memory that has gaps in it. Dory does not navigate toward her goal, she falls toward it. She follows impulse and instinct and half-remembered sensation, and the film trusts this method enough to build its entire structure around it. Think about what that means for the experience of watching it. You are asked as an audience to abandon the certainty of knowing where the story is going, because the character whose eyes you are most inside of does not know either. This creates something unusual, a kind of gentle, ambient anxiety that is not unpleasant, but that keeps you present and attentive in a way that more predictable narratives do not. You cannot relax fully into the comfortable groove of a story whose destination is clear. You can only be here now with Dory in this moment, following this thread, hoping it does not dissolve before it leads somewhere. The Marine Life Institute itself is where the film's most inventive storytelling happens and where its new characters arrive. Hank, the octopus seven-legged cautious, brilliantly articulated, becomes Dory's unlikely companion in the facility's labyrinthine interior. He is a creature of supreme self-sufficiency, someone who has chosen isolation as a form of safety, and who finds himself, almost despite himself, drawn into a partnership with the most gregarious, boundary-dissolving, relentlessly present creature he has ever encountered. The dynamic between Dory and Hank is one of the film's genuine triumphs, and we will spend more time with it when we come to the question of what this film achieves. But for now, what I want you to feel is the texture of this pairing, the contrast between Dory's perpetual openness and Hank's perpetual guardedness, and the way the film uses that contrast not for easy comedy, though it earns that comedy too, but for something quieter and truer, the idea that two very different kinds of loneliness can recognize each other and that recognition can be a form of healing. The pacing of this film is a deliberate artistic choice, and I think it is important to sit with that choice rather than simply accept or resist it. Finding Dory moves the way memory moves, in bursts and pauses, in sudden floods and long silences. There are sequences that are kinetic and breathless, where the visual storytelling is so precise and so inventive that you are completely physically inside the momentum. And there are moments of almost startling stillness, where the film asks you to stop and feel something before it moves on. These contrasts are not accidental, they are the film's way of mimicking the inner experience of its protagonist, the sudden rush of a memory that surfaces and propels, followed by the quiet emptiness when it is gone. MacLane and Nemo, separated from Dory for much of the film's second act, carry a parallel emotional thread that deserves more attention than it sometimes receives. MacLane's relationship with Dory has always been complicated. She is in many ways his opposite. Where he is anxious and controlling and terrified of loss, she is fearless and spontaneous and entirely at peace with not knowing what comes next. In Finding Nemo, this opposition was played largely for warmth and humor. Here the film asks MacLane a harder question. Can he trust someone he cannot protect? Can he love without the reassurance of certainty? These are not small questions. They are the questions that define the difference between love as possession and love as faith. And the way MacLane's arc develops through this film, slowly, imperfectly, with genuine setback, is one of the things that lifts it above a simple adventure story. And here is where the film shifts completely. There is a moment deep in the second act when Dory is separated from everyone she knows in a place she cannot map, following a thread of off memory through corridors of blue light and salt water and glass, and she finds something. She finds the physical place where her earliest sense of self was formed. She finds the habitat that her parents built for her. And she finds it not by remembering correctly, not by following a logical sequence of recollection, but by trusting the feeling beneath the memory, by following the sensory trail that no amount of forgetting could entirely erase. And in that moment, the film makes its deepest argument, the one that all of this has been building toward, that who you are is not what you remember, that identity lives somewhere deeper than memory, that the self is not a story you tell yourself, but something that persists in the body, in the love, in the particular and irreplaceable way you meet the world. I will not go further here, not yet. The spoilers will come in their proper time, in their proper place. But I want you to feel right now the weight of what this film is attempting, the delicacy of it, the ambition of it, the genuine courage it takes to build an animated family film around a protagonist whose defining quality is her inability to hold on to the story she is in. And I want you to feel too the shape of what it achieves, not perfectly, not without the rough edges that we will be honest about, but genuinely warmly with real artistic purpose. This is not simply a sequel, it is a reckoning with what the original film left unasked. It is a story about the character who was always at the edge of the frame, performing her support role with such generous self-effacing joy that no one thought to ask what it cost her. What does it cost to be the one who keeps forgetting? What does it take to build a self out of fragments? What does it mean to be loved by people you cannot remember and to love them back anyway? Finding Dory knows, and it takes nearly 2 beautiful, imperfect, genuinely moving hours to show you. Let me now speak about what this film genuinely achieves. And I want to be precise here, because the word achieves in the context of a Pixar film carries real weight. These are not films that aim modestly, they aim at something essential, something felt rather than described, and the question worth asking is not whether Finding Dory reaches for something meaningful, but how far and how honestly, and at what moments does the reaching become a rival. Begin with Ellen DeGeneres, because you cannot begin anywhere else. There is a thing that happens in voice performance, in the best of it, where the absence of a body becomes an argument for the presence of a soul. You cannot see Ellen DeGeneres. There is no face, no posture, no physical instrument to watch. There is only the voice, and through the voice, everything. What DeGeneres does with Dory is one of the more quietly extraordinary performances in any Pixar film, and I say this having spent time with the full catalogue of this studio's vocal work, which includes some genuinely staggering achievements. What she does here is different from what she did in Finding Nemo, and the difference is not subtle. In Nemo, Dory was energy, pure, irrepressible, generous energy, played with a lightness that made you love her even as it kept you from looking directly at her. Here DeGeneres is asked to slow that energy down, to let it falter, to let the warmth in her voice carry not just joy, but the specific quality of someone who has learned to carry joy as a coping mechanism, as a way of meeting a world that moves faster than she can follow. The scene that proved this completely is not one of the film's big emotional set pieces. It is quieter than that. It is the moment when Dory is alone in the kelp forest, surrounded by the particular silence of deep water, with no one beside her, no thread to follow, and the film stays with her. It does not cut away. It does not rush to rescue her with a joke or a plot development. It simply sits with her in her disorientation, and you hear DeGeneres breathe, not dramatically, not performatively, but with the honest quality of someone standing at the edge of an inner abyss and deciding once again to step back from it. That breath is the whole performance in miniature. That one breath tells you everything about who Dory is, what she carries, and what it cost her to keep going. The supporting ensemble is, without exception, well deployed. Albert Brooks as MacLane is asked to play a quieter, more interior variation of his Finding Nemo arc, and he does so with a precision that rewards close attention. His comedy has always been rooted in anxiety, and here the anxiety is more honest, more specific. It is the anxiety of a parent who knows he cannot be the solution to everything and who is learning painfully to understand this. Ed O'Neill as Hank is a revelation, a character of such unexpected texture and wit that the film's second and third acts gain enormous structural warmth from his presence alone. O'Neill plays Hank with the particular gruffness of someone who does not want to be known, and the quiet transformation of that gruffness into something like reluctant tenderness is the film's most underappreciated emotional through line. Diane Keaton and Eugene Levy as Jenny and Charlie bring something almost unbearably gentle to their roles, a quality of parental love rendered so precisely that the film's most devastating moments hit with the force of a memory you did not know you had. The screenplay written by Andrew Stanton and Victoria Strauss is more sophisticated than it first appears, and this is the part I keep coming back to when I think about what separates it from a functional sequel. Most sequels, even good ones, operate with the same narrative drama as their predecessors, same story shape, new obstacles, familiar beats in fresh clothing. What this screenplay does instead is restructure its entire narrative logic around the consciousness of its protagonist. Dory's short-term memory loss is not a device. It is not a limitation to be overcome. It is the architecture through which the story moves. Every scene is filtered through the question of what Dory can hold on to, and the screenplay uses this not as a creative constraint, but as a creative engine. The flashback structure, which Stanton initially resisted, it is worth noting, becomes the film's emotional spine. Each returning fragment of Dory's past arrives not as exposition but as feeling, as a sensory experience that lands differently each time it surfaces. This is genuinely intelligent writing. It trusts the audience to feel the difference between a memory and a plot point, and it earns that trust. There are lines in this film that stay with you, not because they are witty, though some are, but because they have the quality of truth delivered at the right moment. When Dory says simply, "I looked and I found you," the simplicity of the language is doing enormous work. This is a film smart enough to know that the most profound things often sound the most ordinary, and that the real intelligence of a screenplay is not in its most quotable lines, but in the way every scene accumulates into something that cannot be reduced to any single moment. Now, the visual language. Andrew Stanton's direction of this film is full of choices that are easy to overlook precisely because they work so well that they become invisible. The Marine Life Institute is a masterclass in environmental storytelling. The production designer Steve Pilcher created a world of layered transparencies, glass walls, water tanks, filtered light that constantly places characters in the position of looking through something to find something else. This is not decorative. This is thematic. The entire film is about the relationship between barrier and connection, between what separates and what holds together, and the visual world has internalized this completely. Every frame of the Institute carries the same quiet argument that you can be surrounded by glass and still find your way to what matters. There are three shots I return to specifically. The first is the opening memory sequence, where the color palette is deliberately warmer and softer than the rest of the film. Slightly overexposed, slightly blurred at the edges, the visual signature of how memory looks when it is also love. The second is the shot of young Dory swimming through a field of seashells placed by her parents, each one a small act of devotion made permanent in the sediment. And the third, which I will not describe in full detail yet, as it belongs to the spoiler section, is a shot near the film's conclusion that takes the entire visual language of the film and distills it into a single image. It is one of the most purely cinematic images Pixar has ever produced, and it arrives with the force of something that has been earned across every preceding frame. The sound design of this film deserves more attention than it typically receives in discussions of Pixar's craft. The film uses silence with unusual precision. There are moments in the gulp sequence, in the tank corridors, in the quiet underwater passages, where the sound design chooses to undercut rather than amplify, where the music withdraws, and what you hear instead is only the ambient hum of water, the small mechanical sounds of the facility, the particular texture of being enclosed and apart. This is a sophisticated choice, and it lands with cumulative force by the time the film reaches its most emotionally charged passages. Thomas Newman's score is, in a word, irreplaceable. Stanton has described Newman as one of the cast members of both Nemo and Dory, and after time with both soundtracks, that description feels entirely accurate. Newman's musical vocabulary is built from a particular combination of acoustic and electronic textures, strings that carry warmth, piano lines that carry something more ambiguous, patterns that suggest both the reassurance of home and the restlessness of searching. What he does for Finding Dory specifically is find a way to score memory itself, to give the flashback sequences a musical identity that feels both familiar and slightly out of reach, like something you recognize but cannot quite name. The theme associated with Dory's parents is by itself one of the most quietly devastating pieces of music Newman has written for a Pixar film. It enters in the first 10 minutes and does not leave you. It becomes, by the film's conclusion, the emotional key to the whole experience. What makes this film technically remarkable, and here the craft conversation becomes genuinely fascinating, is the extent to which every layer of construction serves the story's emotional ambition. The animation of water alone is worth contemplation. This is a film about life in and around water and the physics of how light moves through it, how particles suspend in it, how two bodies interact within it. All of this required genuine technical innovation from Pixar's rendering team. But what strikes me most is the animation of expression. In a film where so much emotional weight rests on the face of a small blue fish, the animators needed to achieve an extraordinary range of feeling within the constraints of a non-human face, and the precision with which they do this, the micro-expressions, the way Dory's eyes carry confusion and joy and grief in rapid, honest succession, is a reminder that animation at its best is not a lesser form of performance. It is performance through the hands of artists who understand emotion at a molecular level. Here is the thing about this film's achievements: they are not separate from each other. The performance, the writing, the visual language, the music, the technical craft, they are all saying the same thing in different registers with different tools. They are all making the same argument that Dory matters, that her experience is worth the full weight of cinematic attention, that a story about forgetting is, at its core, a story about the persistence of love. And the fact that every layer of this film's construction bends toward that single argument is what gives it a unity and a coherence that is rarer than it sounds. But now let me be honest, because honest love is more valuable than uncritical praise. Finding Dory is not a perfect film. It is a very good film, a genuine achievement in several specific and important ways, but it carries its flaws openly, and they deserve to be named fairly and without cruelty, because understanding them is part of understanding what the film is and is not. The pacing in the film's middle section, roughly the 30 minutes surrounding Marlin and Nemo strand in the sea lion pool, is the clearest structural vulnerability. The film's momentum, which is so precisely calibrated in its opening and so emotionally precise in its third act, loses coherence here. The Marlin and Nemo subplot, while thematically valuable, feels insufficiently developed. It functions as a structural placeholder, keeping two beloved characters present and active while the real film happens elsewhere, but it does not earn its screen time with the same emotional weight as Dory's interior journey. Marlin's arc of learning to trust is a meaningful idea that the film gestures toward repeatedly without ever quite delivering the scene that would make it land fully. You feel its intention, you sense what it was meant to be, but the execution is thinner than the ambition, and in a film this careful about everything else, that thinness is noticeable. The secondary marine characters, specifically the sea lions Flux and Rhoda and the loon Becky, are the film's most significant tonal miscalculation. This is a minor texture in the whole, not a real wound, but it is worth naming. These characters exist in a register of broad, almost slapstick comedy that sits awkwardly alongside the film's more emotionally precise material. They are funny in the surface way that reliable physical comedy is always funny, but they feel imported from a simpler film, a film that does not have the same ambitions as this one. Every time the story returns to them, there is a small but real deflation, a loss of altitude from which the narrative needs a beat or two to recover. There is also a question worth raising about whether the film's disability representation, for all its genuine care and warmth, is entirely consistent in its framing. Dory's short-term memory loss is handled with real delicacy and insight for much of the film. The flashback sequences, in particular, present her condition not as a limitation to be cured or overcome, but as an integral part of who she is, something that shapes her, costs her, and also in specific and meaningful ways serves her. But there are moments in the film's comedy where the script leans on her forgetting for laughs in ways that slide, briefly and uncomfortably, back toward the register of Nemo, where the forgetting is the joke rather than the person. These moments are few, and they are brief, and the film recovers from them quickly, but they represent a small inconsistency in the film's otherwise thoughtful engagement with its own central subject, and they are worth acknowledging. The film's villain, if we can even call it that, is essentially the institution itself, the Marine Life Institute, and the threat of separation from freedom. But this conflict is never quite given the dramatic tension it needs to feel genuinely threatening. The stakes are clear in concept, but the sense of danger is diffuse. Because the world of this film is so warm, so visually generous, so fundamentally safe in its emotional temperature, the threat of loss never accumulates the urgency that would make the resolution feel truly cathartic rather than simply satisfying. This is a trade-off the film makes consciously, I think. It chooses warmth over tension, comfort over danger, and for most of its audience, most of the time, this is the right choice. But it does mean that the film's emotional release in its final act is gentler than it might have been. More sigh than exhale, more smile than sob. These are real limitations. They are not reasons not to love this film. They are simply the honest shape of it, the places where you can feel the effort and sense the distance between what was reached for and what was fully grasped. Every great film has these places. Finding Dory has fewer than most, but the essay would be poor for pretending they do not exist. Now, let me tell you how this film was actually made. And here is where the story becomes fascinating in ways that reshape how you see specific moments in the finished work. The development of Finding Dory began, in a sense, the moment Finding Nemo ended. Not because Pixar was immediately interested in a sequel. In fact, for years they were not, and Andrew Stanton was the central reason for that delay. Stanton has been publicly resistant to sequels as a form, believing that a story worth telling is a story that said everything it needed to say. He did not want to return to Nemo's world unless he had something genuinely new to say, something the first film had not touched. The 13-year gap between Nemo and Dory is entirely his. It is the mark of a filmmaker who would rather leave money on the table than make something that does not justify its own existence. And when the idea finally came, the idea of telling the story from Dory's perspective, of following the character who was always beside the narrative rather than at its center, Stanton recognized it as something he had not already made. The delay, then, is the film's first fascinating fact. It is the gap between a hit and an honest story, and it is 13 years wide. Here is the first thing that changes how you see the finished film when you know this. Every scene in Finding Dory that treats Dory's interiority with genuine seriousness, every moment where the film stops and breathes and stays with her rather than moving around her, is the direct result of a filmmaker waiting until he had something honest to offer. The patience shows, the care shows. This is a film made by someone who had something to say. The second fact concerns Hank. He is, by any technical measure, one of the most challenging animated characters ever created at Pixar, and it took 4 years of development before the studio was satisfied with him. The team made repeated visits to the Monterey Bay Aquarium to study real octopuses, their movement, their color-changing ability, the extraordinary flexibility of their physiology, the way they problem-solve with a kind of distributed intelligence that is wholly unlike mammalian or fish cognition. The scene in which Hank slinks out from in front of a painting where he has been camouflaging, slides across the floor of the Marine Life Institute, and makes his way to the kitchen sink, took the animation team 2 years to complete. 2 years for a single scene. Think about what that means when you watch it. Every tentacle placement, every chromatic shift, every moment of spatial reasoning that Hank performs in that sequence was individually crafted over the course of what would be, for most films, an entire production cycle. And what you experience in watching it, if you have not been told this, is simply a seamless, funny, visually astonishing scene. You do not see the 2 years. That is what mastery looks like. The third fact concerns storyboards. The film story team produced approximately 103,000 storyboards over the course of 3.5 years. 103,000, each one a decision about how a moment should look, how a scene should breathe, what a character should feel at a given beat of the narrative. This is not unusual for Pixar. The studio is famous for its story development process, for the sheer number of iterations a film goes through before it reaches its final form. But the number is staggering, and it reframes something important. When you watch a scene in Finding Dory that feels inevitable, that feels like it could not have been any other way, you are watching the survivor of an extraordinary process of elimination. You are watching the one image, out of perhaps dozens of alternatives that the filmmakers believed most completely in. This is what inevitable looks like when it is made by hand. The fourth fact concerns the documentary. During production on Finding Dory, Andrew Stanton and his team watched Blackfish, the 2013 documentary about captive killer whales at SeaWorld, which ignited a major public conversation about animal captivity and the ethics of marine entertainment parks. They watched it not to make a polemical film, but because they were setting their story inside a rehabilitation and conservation facility, and they needed to understand the conversation they were entering. The influence of Blackfish on Finding Dory is not a political statement in the film, but it is a moral pressure that you can feel in the way the Marine Life Institute is depicted, not as a villain, not as a paradise, but as something genuinely complicated. A place that helps animals and also confines them. A place built with care and bounded by glass. The film's refusal to simplify this setting is, in part, a direct result of that documentary encounter. The fifth fact concerns Thomas Newman and the question of what music is for. Stanton described Newman as one of the cast members of Finding Nemo, and when he returned to write Finding Dory, he did not commission a new score in a new direction. He asked Newman back specifically because the sound of Newman's music was already part of Dory's world. What Newman did for the sequel was not simply reprise the themes of Nemo, but develop them. Take the same musical vocabulary and age it, deepen it, run it through the emotional experiences of a character who has grown and suffered and longed in the years between the two films. The score for Finding Dory carries the memory of Finding Nemo's music inside it, the way a person carries the memory of who they used to be. It is a compositional choice that most audiences feel without noticing. They feel that the music belongs here, that it sounds like home, that it carries something familiar they cannot quite place. That is Newman doing something technically and emotionally sophisticated, writing continuity as feeling rather than as reference. Each of these facts, the 13-year patience, the 2-year scene, the 100,000 storyboards, the documentary about captivity, the music that remembers its own past, reshapes the experience of watching Finding Dory. They are not trivia. They are the invisible architecture of what you see on screen. They are the proof that this film was not assembled, it was built by people who cared about what they were building and who took the time that caring required. When Finding Dory opened in theaters on June 17, 2016, the numbers it posted were not merely impressive, they were a statement. In its opening weekend alone, the film earned over $135 million in the United States and Canada, the largest opening weekend ever recorded for an animated film at that point in time. By the time it completed its theatrical run, it had grossed $1 billion worldwide, finishing as the third highest grossing film of the entire year and the fourth highest grossing animated film in history up to that point. These figures are not just commercial data. They are a measure of cultural appetite, proof that there was an enormous, patient, emotionally prepared audience waiting for this story, and that when it arrived, it was received not as a studio product but as something more personal. Something people had been waiting to feel. What the box office numbers signal, when you read them carefully, is a particular kind of anticipation. The anticipation of audiences who remembered Finding Nemo not just as a film they had enjoyed, but as a film that had meant something to them, often at a specific and irreplaceable moment in their lives. These were adults who had been children when Nemo released in 2003, now returning with their own children, or returning alone with their memories intact. This is a rare kind of audience relationship. It does not merely show up, it brings its history with it. And the film's extraordinary commercial performance is, in part, a record of how many people needed to close a loop that the first film had opened inside them. Critical response was warm, thoughtful, and in a year with genuinely formidable animated competition, appropriately measured. On Rotten Tomatoes, Finding Dory earned a 94% approval rating, with critics describing it as funny, poignant, and thought-provoking. A film that delivers a beautifully animated adventure that adds another entertaining chapter to its predecessor's classic story. On Metacritic, it scored 77 out of 100, indicating generally favorable reviews from critics who acknowledged its genuine ambition, while occasionally noting that it did not quite reach the transcendent emotional heights of Finding Nemo 4. CinemaScore audiences gave it an A near perfect grade that reflects how completely general audiences felt met and satisfied by what the film delivered. Here is where critics and audiences diverged most interestingly in the question of how to measure this film. Critics, almost without exception, evaluated it relative to Finding Nemo, asked whether it surpassed, equaled, or fell short of its predecessor, and largely concluded that it was a worthy but not superior continuation. Audiences, on the other hand, received it as its own experience. They did not come to judge whether Dory was better or worse than Nemo. They came to spend time with characters they loved, in a world that had shaped them, with a story that gave them something they had not realized they were missing. These are different transactions, and both are legitimate. But the divergence tells you something important about how we relate to sequels emotionally versus how we evaluate them critically. The heart does not measure the way the mind does. The awards landscape for Finding Dory was genuinely surprising. In a year that was extraordinarily rich in animated storytelling, it received 3 nominations at the Annie Awards, including Best Animated Feature, but the prize went elsewhere in a competitive field that included Zootopia and Kubo and the Two Strings. Its most notable award was the Saturn Award for Best Animated Film. And then there was the Golden Globe situation, which is the part I keep returning to as both an injustice and, in a strange way, a kind of backhanded compliment. Finding Dory was entirely omitted from the Best Animated Feature category at the 74th Golden Globe Awards. In a year when it had grossed over $1 billion and held a 94% critical rating, it could not find a nomination. The category went to Moana, Zootopia, and My Life as a Zucchini, among others, all deserving in their own right. But the omission says something about how awards bodies sometimes mistake commercial success for creative simplicity, how a film that many people loved becomes harder to see clearly precisely because so many people loved it. What it deserved, and what it has never quite received, is sustained serious critical engagement with its central achievement of disability and identity. That conversation happened richly and meaningfully in disability art communities and in academic writing, but it did not fully cross into mainstream critical discourse in the way that would have matched the depth of what the film was attempting. That remains for me the most significant thing the award season overlooked. The film's streaming life has been its second chapter, and in many ways a more honest one. On Disney Plus, where it sits alongside the full Pixar library, Finding Dory found its true natural audience. Children discovering it for the first time without the comparative pressure of Nemo, and adults returning to it with the emotional readiness that streaming's private, intimate context enables. The film plays differently at home. The quieter scenes breathe more fully. The emotional precision of the early flashback sequences lands with greater weight when you are not surrounded by the ambient energy of a theater. It is a film that has continued to accumulate meaning in second and third viewings, and its reputation has grown quietly but steadily in the years since its theatrical release. Han. Now, within the larger story of the Pixar Ocean universe, Finding Dory occupies a specific and meaningful position. It is the second film in what might be understood as a loose duology, though Andrew Stanton has declined to fully commit the series to further continuation, suggesting that each story must earn its own existence before it is greenlit. Where Finding Nemo was a film about a father, about parental love expressed as terror and pursuit, about a man whose anxiety had calcified around his child, Finding Dory is a film about the child. Not Nemo, whose story was already told, but the child who was always in the background, the one who was accompanied rather than sought, who helped rather than needed help, who performed her role in someone each year's story with such generous completeness that no one thought to ask whether she also had a story of her own. This is what Finding Dory adds to the conversation that Finding Nemo began. Nemo asked, "What does a parent owe a child?" Dory asks, "What does the world owe someone who has been defined by limitation?" These are not the same question, and the fact that the sequel is ambitious enough to ask a new one rather than simply revisit the old is one of its most significant achievements as a continuation. It deepens rather than repeats. It takes the word of Nemo and presses harder on it, asking the same ocean to carry different emotion weight, and finding that it can, that the world Andrew Stanton built is rich enough to hold multiple stories, multiple kinds of love, multiple versions of what it means to be lost and to be found. The film also shifts the balance of power in its character relationships in ways that matter thematically. In Nemo, Dory was a supporting character who earned a co-lead status through sheer force of presence. Here, she is the protagonist, fully, centrally, without qualification, and the effect is not simply a shift in focus but a shift in moral framework. When Dory's experience is the primary lens, the question of how the world accommodates or fails to accommodate different kinds of minds moves from background texture to foreground argument. MacLane becomes, in this reframing, a character whose good intentions do not automatically translate into right action, and the film is honest enough to show this without making him a villain. He loves Dory. He also sometimes handles her in ways that reflect his anxiety more than her needs. This is not simple, this is human. The franchise, such as it is, now carries two films that are genuinely about something, two films that use the visual richness and emotional warmth of an animated world to ask questions that live-action cinema often cannot ask as directly or as cleanly. Whether a third film will emerge remains, at the time of this essay, an open question. But what already exists is coherent and whole, a two-part story about different kinds of love, different kinds of loss, and what it means to find your way home when home is not a place but a feeling. Let me now step back from the structure of the story and speak about what this film is really saying. Not at the level of theme, which is an academic category, but at the level of feeling, which is where the film actually lives. Here is what Finding Dory understands about human experience. It understands that the self is more durable than the mind. This is a quiet, profound, and genuinely radical idea for a family film to carry. We live in a culture that prizes memory and narrative coherence as the foundations of identity. The idea that you are the story you tell about yourself, the continuous thread of recollection that connects who you were to who you are. Dory breaks this idea gently but completely. She is someone who cannot maintain that thread. She cannot tell a continuous story about herself, and yet she is unmistakably, irreducibly herself. Her kindness is consistent across every reset. Her instinct toward connection is consistent. Her particular quality of openness, the way she meets the world without the accumulated armor of memory-held disappointment, is consistent. These things do not live in her memory, they live somewhere deeper. Think about what that means for every person watching this film who knows what it is to have a mind that does not cooperate with the story they want to tell about themselves. For people with memory conditions, with cognitive difference, with any of the ways a mind can diverge from the expected path, this film is saying something they rarely hear said in the space of a cinema. It is saying you are not less of a person because you cannot hold your own history. You are fully, completely, unreducibly a person, regardless of what you can or cannot recall. And the love that was given to you and the love that lives in you are not stored in memory. They are stored somewhere the forgetting cannot reach. The recurring image of the seashell trail, the path the Dory's parents laid for her through the sediment of the ocean floor, carries this argument in visual form. It is an act of love expressed as physical permanence. Memory is unreliable, the film knows, but the traces left by love outlast the memory of how they were made. The shells are still there, the path is still there, and Dory finds her way home not by remembering the path, but by sensing it, by following something that was laid into the ground of her world before she had the capacity to remember. The film also carries a quiet but serious meditation on what it means to belong. Every major character in Finding Dory is, in some sense, an outsider, someone who does not quite fit the category they are placed in. Hank does not want to be returned to the ocean. Destiny cannot echolocate reliably. Bailey is uncertain of his own sonar. Dory has always been the one who needs to be accompanied rather than trusted to lead. And what the film argues through the accumulation of all these variations on not quite fitting is that competence is not the same as worth. That the value of a person is not located in their abilities but in their presence, in the irreplaceable particular way they exist in relation to others. This is a simple idea stated simply, but the film earns it by showing it rather than telling it, by placing it in the bodies and voices and specific moments of characters who feel genuinely alive. There is also a motif of light through water that runs through the entire film. The way sunlight refracts through the surface of the ocean into the world below, casting patterns of moving illumination on everything it touches. This image recurs and it carries meaning. Light through water is both beautiful and distorting. It reveals and obscures simultaneously. It makes things shimmer and shift. It is the visual signature of a world where perception is always partial, always mediated, always filtered through something. And in a film about a character whose perception of her own history is always partial and filtered, this recurring image is not decoration. It is the film's visual argument made in light. Now, let me speak about the conversation this film arrived into and the conversation it started. Finding Dory opened in June 2016, a cultural moment of genuine complexity and turbulence in the United States and in much of the Western world. It arrived into a year that was already charged with political anxiety, social division, and an increasingly urgent public conversation about who belongs and who is accommodated, and what the cost of difference is in a world that prizes a narrow definition of normal. It would be too simple to say the film was a direct response to that moment. It was not. It was in development for years before any of that specific turbulence had taken the form it did. But it arrived exactly when it was needed, and the conversation it started had a particular resonance that its own creators may not have fully anticipated. The disability community received this film with a depth of engagement that was not matched by mainstream critical discourse, and this remains one of the more significant cultural stories of its release. Disability arts writers and disability advocates wrote about Finding Dory with a seriousness and a personal investment that was striking, analyzing its representation of neurodiversity, discussing whether the humor around Dory's condition was empowering or othering, asking what it means when a studio as powerful as Pixar places disability at the center of a blockbuster narrative rather than at its margins. These conversations were rich and sometimes contentious, and they were more sophisticated than most reviews of the film. The film provoked genuine intellectual engagement about how differently wired minds are depicted in popular culture and about what it means for children who have those minds to see themselves reflected in a protagonist rather than a comic sidekick. What this film understands about cultural representation is that visibility matters differently depending on where you stand in relation to the subject. For most audiences, Finding Dory was a warm, funny, beautifully made animated sequel. For a specific and meaningful portion of its audience, for people with memory conditions, with cognitive difference, with neurodivergent children and neurodivergent selves, it was something that almost never happens in mainstream cinema. It was a film that saw them and said without qualification or condescension, "You are the story, not the obstacle, not the comic relief, not the lesson someone else learns. You are the story." The film also entered into the ongoing Pixar conversation about what animation can do that other forms cannot, and this is specifically the conversation about radical empathy. Pixar's greatest films work by placing you inside a consciousness that is not yours and asking you to feel from within it. A lad who dreams of cooking, an elderly widower whose house lifts off its foundation and carries his grief with it, a child's personified emotions navigating the landscape of loss. Finding Dory belongs in this company, a film that places you inside a mind that forgets and asks you not to observe this but to feel it from within. This is a different kind of empathy than sympathy. Sympathy watches from the outside. What Pixar demands is something more demanding, that you inhabit the experience, that you feel the walls of it, and that you come out the other side having been changed by what you understood from inside. Does this film feel timeless or perfectly of its time? I keep returning to this question and I keep arriving at the same answer. It is both. Its emotional core, the search for the self, the durability of love, the way belonging is made rather than found, is timeless in the way that all genuine emotional insight is timeless. It will speak to someone watching it in 20 years as clearly as it spoke to its first audience. But its specific cultural resonance, its arrival at a moment when conversations about neurodiversity and accommodation and the value of different kinds of minds were gaining urgency in public discourse, gives it a particular historical weight that is also worth honoring. This was a film that arrived at the right moment and asked the right questions in the right language. That does not happen by accident. It happens because the filmmakers were paying attention to the world around them as well as to the story in their hands. From this moment, we go into full spoilers. If you have not yet seen this film, stop here. Go experience it first and come back. Some things deserve to be felt before they are understood. What I want to do in this section is not simply recount what happens. The internet can give you a plot summary. What I want to do instead is trace the emotional logic of what the film reveals, to follow the thread of meaning through each major turning point and show you what the story is actually doing beneath the level of event at the level of design. The hinge on which everything turns, the detail that unlocks the entire film, is so small that you could almost miss it. It is 3 words. Dory, triggered by watching a stingray migration with a class of young children, has a sudden, partial memory, a flash of her parents, a sound, a feeling, the particular amber warmth of belonging, and from that flash 3 words surface through the forgetting, the jewel of Morro Bay. She does not know what it means, she does not know how she knows it, but she knows it is real and she knows, with a certainty that bypasses language and logic and goes straight to the body, that this is where she comes from. The jewel of Morro Bay, California. The Marine Life Institute. This is the pivot. This is the moment where a film about a fish becomes a film about what the body remembers when the mind cannot. What strikes me most about this choice is its absolute fidelity to how memory actually works for people with anterograde amnesia. People who cannot form new long-term memories but retain procedural memory, emotional memory, the memory of the senses. Dory does not remember her parents the way you remember a fact. She remembers them the way you remember a smell that breaks something open in your chest without warning. The film earns this distinction. It does not treat her memory as simply absent. It treats it as differently located, stored in parts of the self that words cannot reach. And this scientific accuracy, this genuine engagement with the neurology of memory as it is actually understood, is one of the film's quiet achievements, one that most audiences feel without knowing why it feels so right. The Marine Life Institute itself is introduced with the visual generosity of a world that has been built to be believed in, and here in its blue-lit corridors and its whispering water tanks, the film introduces its 2 most important new characters in rapid succession. First, Destiny, a whale shark who has been Dory's friend since childhood. The tanks once connected by a pipe through which they communicated, the way children communicate across fences and through walls. Their reunion is warm and immediate and carries the particular texture of a connection that was interrupted rather than ended. 2 people who knew each other before the forgetting, whose shared history exists in Destiny's memory, even if not in Dory's. Destiny remembers. She carries the relationship for both of them, and she does so without resentment, without expectation, with a generosity that mirrors the film's own generosity toward its protagonist. Think about what it means to be remembered by someone who you cannot remember. Think about how that kind of love, patient, asymmetric, unconditional, functions as a form of anchor for someone whose own memory cannot hold, and then hang. Introduced in the back of a stroller, camouflaged against the seat cushion in a moment of genuine visual wit, Hunt is everything Dory is not: self-sufficient, cautious, methodically controlled, allergic to connection. He wants one thing: to be transported to the Marine Life Institute's partner facility in Cleveland rather than released back into the ocean. Why? Because the ocean for Hank is not the symbol of freedom it is for everyone else. The ocean is where he lost something. Something the film holds back for a long time with real craft. Something that made the contained, predictable safety of a tank feel more honest than the open, uncontrollable reality of the sea. He wants Dory's transport tag. She wants his knowledge of the Institute's layout. The transaction is purely pragmatic. What happens between them is anything but. The relationship between Dory and Hank is, I keep returning to this, the film's most underappreciated emotional architecture. The transformation is not sudden and it is not simple. It is built across a series of moments where Hank finds himself doing something he decided long ago he would not do, caring about what happens to someone other than himself. The pivotal scene, the one that shifts their dynamic irrevocably, is the kitchen sequence, where Hank, disguised as a carton of juice, and Dory, navigating the space by memory and instinct, must work together with a precision that requires genuine trust. It is played for comedy and it succeeds completely on that level. But underneath the comedy is something else. Two beings learning each other, learning what the other can and cannot do, and deciding to stay anyway. This is how Hank falls in love with Act of a Companion, in the same way that MacLane once did. Not dramatically, not declaratively, but in the small practical decisions of showing up. Now let me speak about the moment that lives in my chest when I think about this film, not the climax, not the reunion, this moment. It is the moment when Dory, separated from everyone, ends up in the open water alone. The kelp forest sequence I mentioned earlier. She is disoriented. She cannot follow a thread of logic because every thread dissolves before she can reach its other end. And here the film does something that requires real courage. It lets her be lost. It does not immediately save her. It sits with her in the specific grinding quality of being someone who cannot hold on to the story of where she is or where she is going, and it asks the audience to sit there too, to feel that particular kind of lostness from within it rather than at a safe observational distance. And then, in the silence and the dark water and the ambient hum of the kelp, something shifts. Dory stops trying to remember. She stops reaching backward. She listens, not to her memory but to the present, to the texture of what is immediately around her, and something she has been told, some procedural instruction deposited long ago in the part of her mind that holds patterns rather than narratives, surfaces. She begins to follow it. She does not know where it leads, but she follows it anyway. And the film is making its deepest argument here in this quiet, unannounced moment that trust, not memory, not logic, not the coherent narrative of a self that knows its own history, that trust is the actual organ of navigation for a life like Dory's. Trust in the path laid by love, even when the memory of how it was laid is gone. The path leads her to the habitat, to the pipe, to the corridor she has been searching for without knowing she was searching for it. And then she finds the seashells. The shells that her parents laid as a trail for her when she was young, as a coping mechanism, a tactile map of home. The shells are still there, not the same shells. Years have passed, new shells have been added, but the pattern is the same. The gesture is the same. And Dory follows the trail inward toward the habitat where her parents lived and finds it empty. This is the moment I did not expect the film to make. The habitat is empty. Her parents are not there. And for a beat, a long, honest, unhurried beat, the film lets this land with its full weight. Not as a twist, not as a narrative manipulation, but as the representation of a fear that many people with memory conditions carry. The fear that the people who loved them did not wait. That the love was real, but the patience had a limit. That by the time they found their way home, home had already left. And then Dory turns and she sees the shelves, not just inside the habitat, outside it, leading outward, a trail extending through the corridor to the glass walls, out into the open water beyond. Her parents did not simply leave a trail inside their home. They left a trail that extends in every direction, a trail that keeps going, a trail that says, wherever you are, wherever you arrive from, however long it has been, this path will find you. This is what I keep returning to. This is the image that has not left me. Not the reunion, beautiful and earned as it is, but the shells that kept being laid in the years of waiting. The love that expressed itself as physical permanence, as a structure in the world that would outlast any uncertainty about whether it was still wanted. The reunion with Jenny and Charlie is, and I say this without embarrassment, one of the genuinely moving scenes in Pixar's entire catalogue. Not because it is operatic, it is not. It is small and quiet and almost unbearably real. Diane Keaton and Eugene Levy carry the years of waiting in their voices with a delicacy that does not require grand gestures. The moment when Charlie says simply that they never stopped making trails, that every day they made a new trail, a new path leading outward, just in case, lands with the force of something that has earned its arrival across the entire film. The film has prepared you for this moment in every scene that came before it, and it delivers it without manipulation, without orchestral swell, with only the quiet fullness of a love that was never conditional on being remembered. But the film is not finished, because Dory's reunion is threatened immediately. Hank, carrying her tack, is caught and loaded into the truck bound for Cleveland. And here the film shifts into its most kinetic sequence, the truck heist, which is both the film's most commercially satisfying set piece and, if you are reading it carefully, its most thematically consistent one. Because the truck heist is not simply an action climax, it is the moment where every character's arc converges. Martin, who has spent the entire film learning to trust without controlling, must release Nemo into a situation he cannot manage. Nemo, who has been the subject of his father's anxiety for his entire life, must prove that competence and courage are not what they are being compared to. Destiny breaks out of her tent. Through the glass she was never supposed to break, because she trusts Dory's instruction even without knowing exactly where it leads. Billy uses the sonar he spends the whole film doubting. And Hank drives a truck. Hank, who wanted nothing but predictable enclosure, ends up at the wheel of an 18-wheeler hurtling down a California highway with a tiny blue fish on his head, and the shot of this is so absurdly purely joyful that the film earns its own silliness completely. What the climax understands is that the film's action resolution and its emotional resolution are the same event. The moment Dory leads everyone home through the open water, using the navigational method her parents taught her, the gentle spiral outward from a central point, the circular search pattern they practiced when she was too small to swim very far, is the moment the film's thematic argument arrives in full. She is not rescued. She rescues. She does not lead through remembered directions. She leads through a method, a learned, practiced bodily method that lives in her deeper than memory. And she knows it is working not because she remembers learning it, but because it feels like her parents. Because some knowledge lives not in the mind but in the body, not as information but as love made practical. The film's final image, before we cut to the quiet epilogue, is of the open ocean as Dory sees it. The camera moves through the water, and the light refracts through the surface, and the blue is vast, and the world is both familiar and utterly new. Here is where I want you to notice something. Dory does not see the ocean the way MacLane sees it. For MacLane, the ocean has always been primarily a source of threat. Beautiful, yes, but fundamentally dangerous, a space to be navigated with vigilance. For Dory, it is simply where she is. She does not carry the ocean as a problem to be solved. She carries it as a condition of existence, as the medium of her life, with a completeness of presence that is only possible for someone who cannot accumulate the fear that memory of past danger creates. Her relationship with the world is always immediate, always now, always open. And the film's final ocean image, seen through her eyes, lit with her quality of wonder, is the entire film's argument made visual. This is what presence looks like. This is what life looks like when it is not filtered through accumulated dread. The post-credits scene brings back the tang gang from Finding Nemo, the fish who spent the original film plotting their escape from the dentist fish tank, who we last saw in sealed plastic bags floating in the harbor, having escaped but entirely unable to actually do anything next. They arrive at the Marine Life Institute, still in their bags, still bobbing along with their characteristic mix of determined incompetence and genuine camaraderie. It is a warm, funny bookend, a gift to those who loved Nemo, a reminder that the universe of these films is populated with lives that continue in adjacent rooms to the stories we are following. But it also carries something slightly melancholy if you let it. These are fish who achieved their goal and immediately discovered that the goal itself was insufficient, that escape is not the same as arrival, that freedom without community is just a different kind of tang. This too is something the film understands, that Dory's journey was never purely about finding her parents. It was about discovering that belonging is not a place you were born into. It is a thing you build and rebuild with whoever meets you with enough patience and enough love to make it real. There is a particular kind of film that does not announce its impact in the moment of watching. It settles into you quietly, like the tide coming in without you noticing, until the water is already at your feet. Finding Dory is that kind of film for me. I did not walk out of it feeling demolished, the way the most devastating cinema can leave you, the way a film like Grave of the Fireflies or Manchester by the Sea leaves a person. I walked out of it feeling something quieter and, in some ways, more lasting. I walked out of it feeling gently rearranged. Let me step away from the essay entirely for a moment and speak simply as someone who felt this film, the single moment that has not left me. And when I say has not left me, I mean it surfaces unbidden in odd moments, the way certain pieces of music do, the way the memory of a particular afternoon light in a particular place does, is not the reunion. It is not the truck sequence. It is not even the kelp forest theme, as precisely as that scene worked on me. It is the seashell trail extending outward through the corridor, the shells that kept being added every day in every direction, just in case. That image sits in me with a weight that is entirely disproportionate to its narrative function, and I've spent time trying to understand why. Here is what I keep arriving at. That image is the most honest representation of love I have ever seen in an animated film, not love as declaration. Not love as sacrifice, which is the register that cinema most often reaches for when it wants to depict love as serious, but love as practice. Love as the quiet daily decision to keep laying a path for someone who may or may not arrive in a direction you cannot predict at a time you cannot know. Love not as a feeling that burns bright and validates itself through its own intensity, but as a habit of attention maintained without guarantee, without reward, without even the certainty of being received. Charlie and Jenny did not know if Dory would ever find the shells. They did not know if she would remember enough to follow them. They did not know if she was alive. They kept laying them anyway, every day, in every direction, just in case. I am not sure I had words for this quality of love before I saw this image. And having seen it, I find it everywhere in the people who keep showing up for someone who cannot always hold on to the fact of being shown up for, in the patience of anyone who has ever loved someone whose mind or body or circumstance makes continuity difficult, in the small and unremarkable and utterly extraordinary acts of maintenance that constitute most of what love actually is, most of the time in most lives. Cinema rarely gives you an image that functions as a definition. This one does. That is what it left behind in me. Did this film change how I see something? Yes, it changed how I see the relationship between memory and identity in a way that has stayed with me in daily life. I find myself now when I am around people who repeat themselves, who forget the conversations we have had, who cannot hold the narrative thread of our shared history, responding with something different than I did before this film. Not with more patience, exactly, though perhaps that too, but with more genuine curiosity, with the recognition that the person in front of me is entirely themselves, entirely real, regardless of what they can or cannot carry forward from the last time we spoke. The self is not the story. The self is the person telling it, even when the story keeps changing, even when it starts again from the beginning. Would I return to this film? I already have, more times than feels strictly defensible for a film this ostensibly aimed at children. But here is what I have discovered about returning to it. It does not diminish. It does not give up its secrets too easily. The first time you feel the story. The second time, you see the craft. The third time, you begin to notice the accumulation, the way every early scene deposits something that the film will spend its final act to join, the way the visual language builds its argument brick by brick, the way the music is doing something more complex and more loving than background scoring. Finding Dory reveals itself in layers, and each layer is honest, not hidden for the sake of cleverness, but held back because some understanding requires the experience of the whole before any part of it becomes fully visible. What kind of person carries this film with them? I have thought about this. I think it is carried by anyone who has ever been or loved someone who does not fit the template, anyone who has watched a person they love navigate a world that was not designed for the way their mind or body works. Anyone who has wondered whether the qualities that make them difficult to accommodate in a standardized world are the same qualities that make them irreplaceable in a personal one. Anyone who has had to rebuild their sense of who they are from fragments after something took the continuous narrative away. Anyone, in other words, who has ever looked at the gap between who they are and what the world expects them to be and had to decide, without the benefit of a complete and coherent self story, to keep going anyway. That is not a small audience, that is, in one way or another, most of us. Now let me bring this full experience together and speak about it as a whole, honestly, warmly, without the impulse to round its edges into something tidier than it is. Finding Dory is a film with genuine courage at its center. It took a beloved supporting character and built a story worthy of her interiority, a story that does not treat her memory condition as a problem to be solved, but as the very architecture of the film's emotional and narrative logic. It is beautifully made in the specific Pixar sense of craft and care, applied at every layer simultaneously, so that the visual world and the sound world and the performance world and the story world are all bending in the same direction, toward the same argument, at the same time. It is funny, often genuinely and surprisingly so. It is warm in a way that never becomes saccharine because it earns its warmth through honest depiction of what warmth costs. And it carries in its blue lit corridors and its glowing seashells and its open ocean and its one small fish who keeps going without knowing quite why. One of the most quietly profound arguments about love and identity and the durability of the self that any animated film has ever attempted. It is not the equal of Finding Nemo, and I want to be honest about this rather than diplomatic. Finding Nemo has the specific emotional clarity of a film that arrived first, that defined its world rather than continuing it, that had the structural advantage of beginning rather than returning. Its emotional architecture is tighter, its stakes feel higher, and its central relationship between Marlin and Nemo, between a parent's fear and a child's need for independence, arrives with the full force of something that has not been previously explored. Finding Dory works within the world its predecessor built, and that is both its gift and its constraint. It has less room to surprise, it has less blank canvas, and in the places where it reaches beyond what the canvas allows, the middle act, the secondary characters, the subplot that never quite lands, you can feel the limitation. But here is the thing about this film, and it is the thing I want you to leave with. Its limitations are the limitations of ambition. It falls short in places because it is trying to do something hard, and hard things done imperfectly are more valuable than easy things done flawlessly. A film that only attempts what it knows it can achieve is a film that has decided in advance not to matter. Finding Dory matters. It matters to specific people in specific, irreplaceable ways. It made an argument that needed to be made in a form that reached the people who most needed to hear it, and it made that argument with beauty and warmth and genuine cinematic intelligence. Who will love this most deeply? The people who needed the permission it gives. The parents of neurodivergent children who needed to see their child's experience treated as the subject of a story rather than the obstacle in someone else's. The adults who have never quite fit the template and who, in watching Dory navigate the world on her own terms, felt something they could not entirely articulate but recognized as rare. Children who are watching it for the first time with the whole openness of a mind that has not yet learned to measure rather than feel. And anyone who has ever loved someone deeply and been unable to express that love in ways the other person could easily hold on to, who has had to learn to love in a language that might not be received but that was worth speaking anyway. Who may not connect? Those who come to it strictly as a sequel and measure it exclusively against Nemo's emotional heights. Those who need tension rather than warmth in their narrative, for whom the film's fundamental safety and gentleness registers as a lack of stakes. Those who find the pacing of the middle act a genuine impediment rather than a texture to be sat with. These are legitimate responses. They are not wrong. They simply describe a different relationship with what the film is offering. And the film is not for everyone in the same way or at the same depth. Where should you watch it? If you have children, the cinema version of this experience, shared, communal, in the dark together, is worth seeking out on a rewatch in any theater that programs it. But if you are watching alone or returning to it in your own time, I want to gently argue that home is the right context. The quiet of your own space. The ability to pause is something lands particularly hard. The intimacy of a screen that is yours rather than shared with strangers. All of this serves the film's more private emotional frequencies better than a public theater. This is a film that rewards solitude. It is a film that, in its quietest and most honest moments, is speaking directly and only to you. And the rating 8.7 out of 10. Here is the one true sentence that earns it. This is a film that taught me something about love that I had not known I needed to learn, and that is an achievement that belongs to a very short list of films in any year, in any form, in any studio, at any budget. It does not need to be perfect to deserve that. Perfection is a cold virtue. What this film has is something warmer and rarer, a genuine, beating, imperfect, irreducible heart. Here is my last thought, my final image of this film. It is not a scene, it is a quality of light. The particular blue of the water Dory inhabits, not the deep, pressurized dark of the open ocean, not the fluorescent safety of the tank, but the lit, transparent, liminal blue of water near glass, near surface, near the boundary between enclosure and freedom. It is a blue that is neither safe nor dangerous. It is a blue that is simply present. That is, I think, the color of Dory's consciousness, always near the surface of things, always lit from somewhere beyond itself, always carrying the quality of being about to understand something or about to lose it, and finding, somehow, that this is enough, that living at the edge of knowing, at the threshold of remembering, in the always now of a mind that cannot hold its own past too tightly, is not a lesser form of existence. It is, for someone built the way she is built, the only form of existence. And it is full and it is whole and it is genuinely, unambiguously alive. That is something, that is quietly everything. Now, before we part, I want to sit with you for a moment outside the film, the way you sit with someone after a long conversation and feel, for a beat, no need to say anything at all. Thank you. I mean this simply and entirely. Thank you for spending this time here with me in this space between a film and the feeling it leaves. The Cineflux exists because of exactly the exchange we have just had, not a review delivered and received, not information transferred, but an experience shared between people who feel cinema rather than just watch it. That is not a small thing. In a world of content, choosing to sit with something that asks something of you is an act of genuine courage, and I am grateful you made it here. If this essay moved something in you, if there was a moment where you thought, yes, that is exactly it, or where you wanted to pause and think before continuing, I would love to hear which moment that was. Leave it in the comments below. Note the scene you liked best, the moment that felt true to your own experience. That distinction matters to me. And if you have seen Finding Dory through different eyes than mine, if your relationship with Dory's memory condition is personal rather than observational, if this film reached you in a place that my essay could only point toward from the outside, I especially want to hear from you. Because the most important conversation about this film is not the one happening in a critical essay. It is the one happening in the community of people for whom this story was, in some essential way, about them. A few questions worth carrying into the comments, if you are so inclined. First, is there a film that gave you an image, a single, specific visual, that functioned as a definition of something you had never had words for before? Second, how do you feel about the relationship between Finding Nemo and Finding Dory? Is the sequel enhanced or diminished by living in its predecessor's shadow, or does it find its own light entirely? And third, if you could give Dory one more scene, one moment the film left unwritten, what would it be? And before I let you go, in the next essay on the Cine Flux, we are going somewhere very different. A different ocean, a different light, a different kind of blue. A film that arrived quietly and stayed permanently. I will not tell you more than that yet. But if you have been here before, you know what that kind of restraint means. It means the film is worth waiting for. If this essay gave you something, please leave a like. It costs you nothing and it means more than you know. Subscribe if you want to keep feeling films this way. Share it with whoever in your life treats cinema as something worth taking seriously. That is the Cineflux. I will see you in the next one. In fact,